"You're not qualified for trauma cases." The words hit Dr. Sarah Chen like a slap as she stood in the emergency room hallway. Her supervisor, Dr. Marcus Webb, didn't even look up from his clipboard as he delivered the verdict that would change everything. Stick to minor injuries and discharge paperwork. Leave the real medicine to those of us who've actually seen blood. The other doctors smirked as they walked past, their expensive shoes clicking against the polished hospital floor. To them, Sarah was just another diversity hire, a quiet Asian American woman in her early 30s who somehow got lucky enough to land a position at St. Mary's Hospital, one of Chicago's most prestigious medical centers. What none of them knew was that the woman they were dismissing had once performed emergency surgery with nothing but a flashlight and borrowed instruments, while mortar shells exploded overhead. What they couldn't see was that her steady hands had pulled 47 soldiers back from death's door in the most hellish conditions imaginable. And what would shock them to their core was that she held the Silver Star, America's third highest military decoration, for actions so classified that her name appeared nowhere in official records. But Sarah Chen had learned long ago that some battles aren't worth fighting. Some truths are too heavy for civilians to carry. So she simply nodded, walked to the supply closet, and began restocking bandages, while her colleagues prepared for another ordinary day at one of America's busiest trauma centers. They had no idea that their ordinary day was about to become anything but ordinary. And they had no idea that the woman they just dismissed would soon be the only thing standing between life and death for dozens of people. The first sign of trouble came at 2:47 p.m. when the emergency radio crackled to life. Multiple casualties inbound. Bus accident on I-94. Estimated 40 victims, including children. ETA 7 minutes. Dr. Webb straightened his tie and assumed command with the confidence of someone who'd never doubted his authority. "Johnson, prep Trauma Bay 1. Stevens, get surgery on standby. Chen, you handle the walking wounded in triage." Sarah bit back her response. In Iraq, she'd handled worse with half the resources and none of the backup. But here, she was relegated to checking scrapes and bruises, while the real doctors handled the serious cases. The ambulances arrived like a convoy under fire. Paramedics rushed through the doors, carrying victims on stretchers, their faces grim with the knowledge that this was beyond their usual scope. The emergency room erupted into controlled chaos as nurses rushed between patients and doctors shouted orders. But within minutes, the controlled chaos became uncontrolled panic. "I need help over here." Dr. Johnson's voice cracked as he stared at a child with internal bleeding, his hands shaking as he tried to establish an 4-line. The boy, maybe 8 years old, was going into shock, his vital signs plummeting faster than Johnson could compensate. Dr. Stevens was hunched over an elderly woman with a collapsed lung, sweat beading on his forehead as he struggled with a chest tube insertion he'd only practiced on mannequins. His movements were hesitant, uncertain, and precious seconds ticked away. Dr. Webb himself was frozen at the bedside of a teenage girl with multiple fractures and possible spinal injuries. His textbook knowledge meant nothing when faced with the real-time decision of whether to risk paralysis or death. From her position in the corner, Sarah watched the scene unfold with a familiar hollow feeling in her chest. She'd seen this before, doctors who looked good on paper crumbling under pressure. Leaders who commanded respect in meetings, falling apart when lives hung in the balance. The 8-year-old's monitor flatlined. Dr. Johnson stepped back, his face pale. I can't. Someone else needs to." That's when Sarah moved. She didn't ask permission, didn't wait for orders. She simply stepped forward, her hands already reaching for the defibrillator. "Move," she said quietly, but something in her voice made Johnson step aside immediately. What happened next would be replayed in the minds of everyone present for years to come. Sarah's movements were different from anything they'd ever seen. Not hurried, not panicked, but precise with the mechanical efficiency of someone who'd done this 1,000 times before. Her hands found the boy's pulse points, while her eyes scanned monitors, calculating oxygen saturation and blood pressure in the time it took others to read the numbers. "He's in hemorrhagic shock," she announced, already moving to establish new 4 access. "Probable splenic rupture. We need O-negative blood, 2 units, and prep the OR for emergency laparotomy." Dr. Webb started to protest. Chen, you're not authorized to. Shut up. The words were spoken softly, but they carried absolute authority. Johnson, start bagging him. Stevens, I need surgical supplies. Webb, call surgery and tell them we're coming up. For a moment, everyone stood frozen. Then, as the boy's color began to return with Sarah's interventions, they moved. Sarah's hands worked with impossible steadiness, inserting 4 lines that other doctors had failed to establish, stabilizing vitals that had been crashing moments before. But it was more than technical skill. It was the way she moved between patients, triaging with glances that seemed to see straight through to the heart of each injury. Pneumothorax, left side, she said, examining the elderly woman Stevens had been struggling with. Her hands located the insertion point for the chest tube instantly. Local anesthetic, please. Stevens watched in amazement as Sarah performed the procedure he'd been fumbling with, her movements economical and sure. The woman's oxygen levels immediately improved. Spinal precautions, Sarah continued, moving to the teenage girl. But the paralysis risk is minimal compared to the internal bleeding. We need to move her now. One by one, she stabilized patients that had been deteriorating under the care of her supposedly superior colleagues. But it wasn't just her medical skills that stunned them. It was her calm. While they had been consumed by panic and indecision, she had remained utterly composed, moving through the chaos like she belonged there. Dr. Webb watched from beside the nurse's station, his earlier condescension replaced by something approaching awe. Where did she learn to do that? Nurse Patricia Martinez, a 20-year veteran of ER, shook her head slowly. I've never seen anything like it. It's like she's done this before. A lot. They had no idea how right she was. For the next 3 hours, Sarah worked without stopping. 26 serious casualties, including 12 children, passed through her hands. Not one of them died on her watch. Not one. When the last patient was stabilized and transferred to appropriate care, Sarah quietly returned to the supply closet to continue restocking bandages. Her hands, which had just saved dozens of lives, shook slightly as she sorted gauze and tape. Dr. Webb approached hesitantly. Sarah, that was incredible. Where did you train? Sarah didn't look up from her work. Army, she said simply. Army Medical Corps? Which unit? I mean, to have that kind of trauma experience, you must have been deployed to some serious combat zones. For a long moment, Sarah didn't answer. When she finally spoke, her voice was barely above a whisper. Something like that. What she didn't say was that she'd spent 18 months as the only combat medic for a forward operating base that saw more casualties than any field hospital. What she didn't mention was that she'd performed surgery in bombed-out buildings with nothing but a headlamp for illumination. What she couldn't explain was how many soldiers had lived because she'd learned to work miracles with whatever supplies she could scavenge. The next day brought a visitor that changed everything. Sarah was in the break room, eating a sandwich alone as usual, when Nurse Martinez approached with an expression of confusion and concern. Sarah, there's someone here to see you. He says he's a general, but he won't talk to anyone else. He's in the chief's office. Sarah's sandwich suddenly tasted like cardboard. She'd known this day might come, but she'd hoped her past would stay buried. With heavy steps, she walked toward the administrative offices, past the curious stares of colleagues who'd witnessed her performance the day before. The man waiting in the chief's office wore a crisp dress uniform with stars on his shoulders that commanded immediate respect. General Michael Reeves had the bearing of someone accustomed to being the most important person in any room. But when he saw Sarah, his expression softened with something approaching reverence. Sergeant Chen, he said, rising from his chair. Or should I say, Dr. Chen now? Hospital Chief Administrator David Reynolds looked confused and slightly intimidated. General, I'm not sure I understand. Dr. Chen never mentioned military service beyond basic Army medical training. General Reeves smiled grimly. That's because Sergeant Chen's service record is classified at the highest levels. What I can tell you is that the woman you employed as a junior emergency physician is one of the most decorated combat medics in United States Army history. Sarah remained silent, her face carefully neutral, but her hands clenched at her sides. I heard about yesterday's incident. General Reeves continued. 26 casualties, 0 deaths. That's the kind of performance we came to expect from Sergeant Chen during her deployment to Fallujah. The words hung in the air like a bomb waiting to detonate. Dr. Webb, who had been called into the meeting, leaned forward with sudden interest. Fallujah. But that was some of the heaviest fighting of the entire Iraq War. Indeed it was, General Reeves confirmed. Sergeant Chen served as the primary combat medic for Forward Operating Base Liberty during the Second Battle of Fallujah. For 6 months, she was the only medical personnel for a base that came under daily attack. Sarah finally spoke, her voice tight with controlled emotion. General, this isn't necessary. I disagree, Sergeant. These people need to understand who they're working with. General Reeves turned to address the room. During her deployment, Sergeant Chen treated over 200 combat casualties. Her survival rate was 94%, unprecedented for field conditions. She performed surgery in bunkers while under mortar fire. She crawled through sniper zones to reach wounded soldiers. She once operated continuously for 22 hours straight during a coordinated insurgent attack. Dr. Webb's mouth opened and closed soundlessly. The woman he dismissed as unqualified had done things he couldn't imagine. But more than her medical skills, General Reeves continued, was her leadership under fire. When the base came under siege and the commanding officer was killed, Sergeant Chen took command of medical operations for the entire compound. She coordinated casualty evacuation under impossible conditions and maintained morale when everyone else had given up hope. Sarah's jaw tightened. You're making it sound more heroic than it was. Am I? General Reeves reached into his briefcase and pulled out a frame containing a medal. The Silver Star, its ribbon bright against dark velvet. This was awarded for your actions on March 15, 2005. Would you like me to read the citation? No. Sarah's voice was sharp enough to cut, but General Reeves read it anyway. For conspicuous gallantry and intrepidity in action against an enemy of the United States. Sergeant Chen, while serving as combat medic, repeatedly exposed herself to intense hostile fire to treat wounded personnel. When the base medical facility was destroyed by mortar fire, she established a field hospital in an underground bunker and continued treating casualties throughout a 14-hour siege. Her actions directly resulted in saving 23 American lives. The room fell silent. Dr. Reynolds stared at Sarah as if seeing her for the first time. Dr. Webb looked like he wanted to disappear into the floor. 23 lives, General Reeves repeated. In one day, under conditions that would have broken most people. Sarah stood abruptly. Are we finished here, General? Not quite. His expression grew more serious. There's something else they need to know. The reason your record is classified. Sarah's face went pale. Don't. You were wounded during that siege, Sergeant. Shrapnel from a mortar round. You continued treating patients while bleeding from multiple wounds. When the evacuation helicopter finally arrived, you refused to leave until every wounded soldier was loaded first. He paused, his voice growing quiet. You were clinically dead for 4 minutes on that helicopter. The medics brought you back, but the injury left you with chronic pain and PTSD that ended your military career. The revelation hit the room like a physical blow. Sarah's hands shook visibly now, and she gripped the back of her chair for support. The Army offered you full disability pension. General Reeves continued. You refused it, said you didn't want pity. You went back to school, became a civilian doctor, and tried to start over. But the nightmares followed you. The guilt over the soldiers you couldn't save. The flashbacks triggered by medical emergencies. Dr. Webb found his voice. That's why you've been so quiet. Why you didn't want trauma cases. Sarah's control finally cracked. Because every time I see someone bleeding, I'm back there. Every time I hear monitors beeping, I remember the ones that stopped beeping. Every life I save here reminds me of ones I lost there. Tears streamed down her face now. Years of suppressed emotion finally breaking free. You want to know why I didn't tell you about my experience? Because I wake up every night, seeing the faces of soldiers I couldn't save. Because I count the ones who died under my hands more than the ones who lived. The room was utterly silent except for Sarah's quiet sobs. General Reeves spoke gently. "Sergeant, you saved more lives in 18 months of deployment than most doctors save in entire careers." "But not all of them," Sarah whispered. "Never all of them." Dr. Webb stepped forward hesitantly. "Sarah, what you did yesterday was incredible. Those 26 people are alive because of you." Sarah wiped her eyes and straightened her shoulders, the soldier reasserting itself over the broken woman. "I did my job. That's all." "No," General Reeves said firmly. "You did much more than that. And these people deserve to know they've been working alongside a hero." "I'm not a hero," Sarah replied automatically. "I'm just someone who couldn't save enough people when it mattered most." The conversation was interrupted by a knock on the door. Nurse Martinez entered with an apologetic expression. "I'm sorry to interrupt, but there's been another accident. Multi-car collision on Lakeshore Drive. We're expecting 30 casualties in the next 10 minutes. Dr. Webb looked at Sarah with new understanding. "Will you take lead on this one?" For a moment, Sarah hesitated. Taking charge meant confronting her demons again. It meant reliving the chaos and pressure that haunted her dreams. But it also meant saving lives. And despite everything she'd suffered, despite all the nightmares and guilt, that was still what mattered most. "Yes," she said quietly. "I'll take lead." As they walked toward the emergency room together, General Reeves spoke once more. "Sergeant Chen, you may have left the Army, but you never stopped serving." Sarah didn't respond, but something in her posture straightened. The broken woman who'd been hiding in supply closets was gone. In her place stood the combat medic who'd held the line when everything else fell apart. The casualties began arriving, and once again, Sarah moved through the chaos with deadly precision. But this time, her colleagues worked alongside her instead of dismissing her. They followed her orders without question, trusting in skills they now understood had been forged in the crucible of war. And as Sarah's hands worked to save lives with the same steady precision that had made her a legend in Fallujah, she realized something important. The nightmares would always be there. The guilt would never fully fade. But the skills she'd learned in hell could still serve heaven. Sometimes the greatest battles aren't fought with weapons, but with steady hands and a refusal to give up. Sometimes the most important victories happen in hospital rooms instead of battlefields. And sometimes the real heroes are the ones who keep saving lives long after the war is over. Dr. Sarah Chen had come home from Iraq, carrying wounds that would never fully heal. But she'd also brought back something invaluable, the unshakable knowledge that every life matters and the skills to prove it. If this story touched you and you found something meaningful in it, please don't forget to hit that like button and subscribe to support more stories like this.